So picture this. It's 1989, right? And the president of Sri Lanka secretly reaches out to a violently active insurgent group inside his own borders.
Right.
But he's not trying to negotiate a peace treaty. He is actually quietly handing over massive caches of weapons and ammunition to these insurgents.
Which is just wild to even think about.
Right. And why is he doing this? So they can use those exact weapons to kill soldiers from the Indian Army, which is the very army currently deployed in his country, taking heavy casualties specifically to protect his government.
Yeah, it completely defies any kind of conventional military logic.
It really does. I mean, when the host nation starts arming the terrorists to fight the peacekeepers, you know, you've entered this, like, operational nightmare where the normal rules of warfare they completely disintegrate.
They do. But, it perfectly illustrates the central theme of this conflict. You can have all the firepower in the world, right? But if the political ground beneath you collapses, your military operation is essentially standing on quicksand.
Exactly. So welcome back to the deep dive. We are officially entering Module 3 of our continuous 4-part exploration into Operation PAWAN.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a heavy one.
It is. Now, if you were with us for Module 2, you know we covered the strategic background and those initial, honestly, pretty shocking combat experiences of the Indian Peacekeeping Force, the IPKF, as they deployed.
Right, the early days.
Yeah. But today, we are shifting gears. We're moving away from the, visceral day-to-day battlefield stuff, and we're stepping into the shoes of the military strategists. We are looking at the hard, cold military lessons.
Exactly. Our objective today for you is to conduct a really thorough operational analysis. We're going to extract the actionable military lessons from the IPKF's deployment, right? We need to examine how conventional forces adapt, or, tragically, how they fail to adapt to asymmetric warfare.
Right.
And ultimately, we are going to contrast the immense struggles of the IPKF in the late 1980s with the incredibly decisive, albeit brutal, victory of the Sri Lankan armed forces against the LTTE 2 decades later.
Yeah, and before we dive into the actual mechanics of these battles, I need to make something explicitly clear to you, the listener.
This is an important caveat.
Very important. Today's discussion is going to cover highly politically charged events. I mean, we'll be analyzing brutal tactics, grim battlefield realities, and severe human rights issues.
Right.
But we are doing this strictly from the perspective of the provided military source material. Our goal here is to impartially analyze operational effectiveness. We are not endorsing any viewpoints, any political actions, or, any atrocities committed by any side in this decades-long conflict.
Exactly. We're looking at this clinically. It's a study of military history and strategy.
Right, so that distinction is vital. To extract genuine lessons, we have to look at the mechanics of what happened, the literal how and the why behind the outcomes, stripping away the emotional or political biases.
Yeah, to truly understand the military reality on the ground.
Okay, so let's start with that bizarre scenario I mentioned at the top of the show. Chapter 10. We need to look at the political circumstances of the IPKF's exit from Sri Lanka, because it really sets the stage.
It does, yeah. It proves the point about strategic failure dictating tactical timelines.
Right, so bringing us to the events of late 1988 and 1989, the IPKF had actually managed to assist in the conduct of provincial elections in the northern and eastern provinces.
Which was a massive logistical feat in itself.
It was, and this created enough of a conducive atmosphere for Sri Lanka to hold its own general election. But the result of that election completely just upended the chessboard.
It really did. President Jaywardene, the man who had originally signed the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord and invited the Indian forces in, he stepped down. And Mr. R. Premadasa was elected as the new president of Sri Lanka.
And Premadasa was, famously hostile to the Indian presence, right?
Intensely hostile. I mean, Premadasa had always been antagonistic toward the Accord. Back when he was prime minister, he purposefully scheduled a diplomatic visit to Japan just to ensure he wouldn't even be in the country when the Accord was being signed.
Wow, just completely washing his hands of it.
Exactly. He viewed the IPKF not as peacekeepers, but as an occupying foreign army. So once he secured the presidency, his primary objective was to get the Indian military out of his country immediately. He even went so far as to set a public unilateral deadline, July 29, 1989, which was the second anniversary of the accord for the complete withdrawal of Indian troops.
Okay, wait. I have to push back a little on the framing of this as some shocking, unpredictable betrayal by Premadasa.
Okay, let's hear it.
I mean, India went in, uninvited initially, to enforce a treaty on a sovereign nation. Why wouldn't a newly elected nationalist leader try to arm local insurgents to bleed what he viewed as an occupying force? That just seems like basic, albeit ruthless, statecraft. Shouldn't Indian intelligence have seen that coming a mile away?
That is a very, very fair critique, and it highlights a massive failure in strategic foresight on India's part. You are correct. From Premadasa's perspective, this was rational statecraft.
Right.
But from the perspective of the IPKF soldiers who are actively bleeding on the ground to uphold an agreement signed by Premadasa's own government, it was a profound paradox.
Yeah, I can't imagine the morale hit.
It was devastating. When Premadasa realized that the Indian government wasn't just going to withdraw its troops based on his political ultimatums, he fundamentally shifted his strategy. He secretly initiated contact with the LTTE. He met with their reps and struck a deal to provide them with arms.
Which brings us back to the LTTE. I mean, why on earth would they agree to this? Weren't they engaged in a brutal war against the Sri Lankan government just a few months prior?
They were, absolutely. But, warfare creates strange bedfellows, completely driven by immediate necessity. The LTTE was suffocating at that point.
Under the pressure from the Indian Army.
Exactly. The sheer mass and continuous pressure of the IPKF's military operations were grinding them down. They were taking heavy losses, their supply lines were disrupted, and they were desperate for the IPKF to leave so they could just regroup.
So both the host government and the insurgents suddenly have the exact same goal.
Yes, both the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE found themselves sharing a singular immediate goal, the expulsion of the Indian military. But their long-term motives were entirely self-serving and, frankly, completely delusional.
Delusional in what sense? Like they miscalculated?
Severely miscalculated. Both sides severely underestimated the other. President Premadasa calculated that if he could just use the LTTE to harass the Indians into leaving, the Sri Lankan army could then easily swoop in and crush an LTTE that had been heavily degraded by the IPKF.
Ah, and the LTTE thought the exact opposite.
Exactly. Prabhakaran, the leader of the LTTE, calculated that once the massive conventional might of the Indian armed forces was removed from the board, his guerrilla fighters could easily outmaneuver and defeat the Sri Lankan military.
So they both thought they were playing the other.
Right. They both believed they were using the other as a temporary pawn, and they were both wrong about how easily they could control the aftermath.
So, as a military commander, you have the host nation actively arming the insurgents you are fighting. What is the military stance in a situation like that? How does the IPKF commander on the ground even begin to react?
It creates an incredibly volatile environment. I mean, from a strictly military standpoint, the IPKF held its ground. The Indian government at that time refused to capitulate to Premadasa's public deadline.
So they didn't just pack up and leave in July.
No, they continued their combat operations against the LTTE, but they drew a very hard, very clear line with the Sri Lankan government. They communicated explicitly that if the Sri Lankan armed forces attempted to use military means to forcefully evict the IPKF from their bases, the IPKF would immediately shift from a restrained counterinsurgency posture into a full-scale conventional war mode.
Meaning, they would drop the peacekeeping pretense and bring the full, devastating conventional might of the Indian military to bear directly against the Sri Lankan state.
Exactly. It was a high-stakes game of geopolitical chicken. The Indian military was effectively daring the Sri Lankan military to take a shot.
Wow.
Ultimately, though, it wasn't this standoff that caused the withdrawal. It was domestic politics back in New Delhi. In December 1989, there was a change in the central government in India. The new administration looked at the quagmire, looked at the total lack of consent from the host nation, and just decided to pull the plug.
But on their own terms.
Yes, they insisted on doing it on their own timeline, not Premadasa's. The de-induction was organized in a highly methodical, orderly manner, wrapping up on March 24, 1990.
So for a strategist analyzing this conflict, what's the core military takeaway from this whole bizarre exit?
The absolute non-negotiable necessity of defining a clear political end state and a viable exit strategy before you commit troops to a foreign intervention.
Right, because otherwise you're just stuck.
Exactly. If your political aim is ambiguous, or if you lose the consent of the host nation, your military force is left operating in a vacuum. You can win individual firefights, you can secure towns, but without an exit strategy tied to a stable political reality, you are just expending lives and treasure for ground you can never permanently hold.
Okay, so with the IPKF officially out of Sri Lanka by early 1990, I want to rewind the timeline just slightly. Chapter 11. We need to look closely at the actual mechanics of the fighting itself.
The employment of arms and services.
Exactly. How did the conventional Indian arms and services actually operate on the ground? Let's break down the employment of forces, starting with the infantry, which, is usually the backbone of any counterinsurgency operation.
The infantry was indeed the backbone, but the IPKF infantry battalions went into Sri Lanka operating under severe, almost crippling logistical and administrative constraints. First and foremost, you have to consider their manpower. Due to the rushed nature of the deployment, practically all the infantry battalions were inducted, operating at roughly 50% of their authorized strength.
Wait, half strength? How does a modern professional army deploy a battalion into a combat zone missing half of its soldiers?
Because the mobilization orders were issued at the absolute last minute, around October 8, 1987. You have to remember the administrative reality of a peacetime army.
Oh, like people are on leave.
Exactly. Troops were on scheduled annual leave, they were away attending specialized training courses, or they were deployed on temporary duties across India. By the time these soldiers actually received their recall orders, traveled across the massive country, and rejoined their units, those units had already been thrust directly into heavy combat in Sri Lanka.
That's insane.
You essentially had infantry brigades trying to secure entire districts while missing the equivalent of 1 or 2 full battalions of riflemen.
That is like stepping into the ring with one arm tied behind your back. And the source material mentions other massive operational handicaps too, like a total lack of maps and a severe language barrier.
The lack of topographical survey maps was a major hindrance. It forced units to operate blindly in unfamiliar terrain. But the language barrier was perhaps the most strategically damaging constraint.
Because they couldn't talk to anyone.
Right. Apart from a couple of battalions from the Madras Regiment, the vast majority of the Indian troops has no functional understanding of Tamil.
And in an insurgency, if you can't speak the language, you are essentially deaf and blind.
Precisely. Counterinsurgency relies heavily on human intelligence. If you cannot interrogate a captured suspect, if you cannot read local signage or intercept documents, and most importantly, if you cannot converse with the local civilian population to build trust and gather tips, you cannot dismantle an insurgent network.
You're just a foreigner with a gun at that point.
Exactly. The IPKF was entirely reliant on external translators, which slowed down operations and completely compromised operational security.
And compounding all of this, these troops were suddenly thrust into urban warfare. The military acronym is BUA, right? Built up areas. Let's talk about the mechanics of that, because fighting in a jungle is very different from fighting in a city like Jaffna.
Night and day difference. Urban insurgency was an entirely alien environment for the Indian Army at that time. Their doctrine and experience were geared toward rural insurgencies, like in the northeast of India, or conventional warfare on open plains.
Right, big tank battles.
Yeah, but suddenly they are in the densely populated Jaffna Peninsula, forced to conduct agonizing house-to-house clearing operations against an enemy that had spent years heavily mining and booby-trapping the urban infrastructure.
I try to visualize this, and the metaphor that keeps coming to mind is that it's like trying to navigate a dark, fragile china shop, but instead of sending in one person with a flashlight, you send in a bulldozer with the headlights turned off.
That's a very apt analogy.
I mean, the sources constantly mention a lack of fire and movement and this deadly tendency for the troops to bunch up.
The bulldozer metaphor is highly accurate. When conventional troops are placed under extreme psychological stress in an unfamiliar, highly lethal urban environment, basic human nature often overrides training.
They want to stick together.
Soldiers instinctively seek security in numbers. So instead of advancing on a broad front, utilizing bounding overwatch and spreading out to outflank enemy positions, an entire company would just cluster together and move slowly down a single, narrow street.
Which is a disaster waiting to happen.
Exactly. If the lead element took fire and got pinned down, the entire clustered column was trapped behind them in a fatal bottleneck.
And clustering together is the absolute worst possible thing you can do, given the specific weapons the LTTE possessed, right?
It was a fatal tactical error. Let's look at the mechanics of the weaponry. The LTTE were predominantly armed with AK-47 assault rifles. The AK-47 provides a highly reliable, superior rate of fully automatic fire, perfect for close-quarters urban combat.
Right.
The IPKF infantry, conversely, were largely armed with the heavier 7.62mm SLR, the self-loading rifle.
Which is a semi-automatic weapon.
Exactly. It's an excellent, highly accurate weapon for long-range engagements on an open battlefield. But in a sudden, close-range urban ambush, That rate of fire is a massive disadvantage.
Yeah, you pull the trigger once, one bullet comes out.
Right. If your troops bunch up in an alleyway to feel safe, they present a massive, dense, unmissable target for a sudden burst of automatic fire from an AK-47, or worse, a command-detonated claymore mine hidden in a wall.
What about patrolling? When we think of counterinsurgency today, we picture small, stealthy squads moving through the brush. Did the IPKF operate that way?
Initially, they did exactly the opposite. The officers became wedded to the concept of massive, company-sized patrols.
Like 100 guys walking together?
Yes. But the mechanical reality of patrolling in an insurgency is that your goal is area domination and baiting the insurgent into a mistake. You achieve that by saturating an area with numerous small, highly mobile patrols that keep the enemy guessing about your locations.
Not stomping around with 100 guys.
Right. A single massive patrol consisting of 80 or 100 men is incredibly noisy, very slow, and absurdly easy for a local guerrilla force to detect, track, and simply walk around or set up an ambush ahead of.
The sources explicitly mentioned that the LTTE could literally track these massive IPKF patrols just by listening to their radio chatter and the sheer noise of their movement.
Yes. The IPKF commanders knew they were being shadowed by LTTE scouts. The basic textbook tactical remedy for being shadowed is to execute what we call shedding an ambush.
How does that work?
As the large patrol moves forward down a jungle track, you secretly drop 2 or 3 men behind, hiding them in the deep brush facing backward. When the LTTE shadower confidently walks down the trail following the main body, he walks point blank into the trap you just left behind.
No, that's smart.
It is, but the IPKF frequently neglected these elementary tactical principles in the initial shock and confusion of the conflict.
Okay, so the infantry is struggling to adapt these sledgehammer tactics. Let's look at the heavier assets. Armor and mechanized infantry. You would assume that rolling a column of main battle tanks into an insurgent stronghold would just end the fight through sheer intimidation and firepower.
In an open desert, massed armor is devastating.
Yeah.
In the specific geography of the Jaffna Peninsula, it was a severe liability.
Because of the urban terrain.
Exactly. The terrain was characterized by dense, built-up areas, narrow streets, and numerous lagoons and water bodies. This completely restricted the freedom of maneuver that tanks absolutely rely on to survive. Conventional doctrine dictates that you use tanks en masse to overwhelm the enemy. But the restrictive terrain forced the IPKF to break up their armored formations and use them in what the military terms penny packets.
Explain penny packets mechanically. We're talking about what, sending just 1 or 2 tanks down a narrow street on their own?
Precisely. And a tank isolated in a narrow urban street is highly vulnerable. Its main gun cannot elevate or depress enough to hit targets on rooftops or in basements. And the turret often cannot traverse fully, without hitting the buildings on either side, without a screen of dismounted infantry walking alongside to clear the adjacent buildings and protect the tank's blind spots. An isolated tank is just a massive steel coffin waiting for a guerrilla to lean out of a second-story window with a handheld, rocket-propelled grenade.
And didn't the rules of engagement make this even harder for the tank crews?
Yes, very much so. The IPKF was operating under strict political directives to minimize civilian casualties. This meant severe restrictions on speculative fire.
Meaning they couldn't just shoot at a suspicious window.
Exactly. If a tank crew suspected a building might hold an ambush, they couldn't simply blast the building to neutralize the threat. They had to wait until they were actually fired upon. Because of these constraints, the armor suffered heavy initial losses until they finally refined their battle drills, ensuring that infantry thoroughly secured the flanks before the tanks ever rolled into a street.
And what about the mechanized infantry? The troops who ride into battle inside those armored personnel carriers, the ICVs?
That provided another tragic mechanical lesson. An infantry combat vehicle, or ICV, is designed to protect troops from small arms fire and shrapnel on a conventional battlefield. But in an urban environment, heavily seated with massive improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, the physics work completely against you.
How so?
The blast cone of a buried IED on a hard paved road is channeled directly upward into the thin belly armor of the vehicle.
So the vehicle just becomes a trap.
Exactly. The tendency of the mechanized troops in the initial stages was to stay buttoned up inside the vehicles, treating them like armored taxis to drive to contested zones. They would roll over massive LTTE IEDs, resulting in the catastrophic destruction of the vehicle and the death of everyone inside.
That's horrific.
What they needed to do, and what they eventually learned at great cost, was to dismount. The infantry must walk outside, dispersing their formation, scanning for disturbed earth that indicates a mine, and providing close protection to the vehicle, using the vehicle's heavy gun for direct fire support, rather than just riding blindly into a minefield.
Okay, so the conventional sledgehammer is getting chipped away, and they're taking heavy losses learning these lessons. But where did the IPKF actually find success? Let's analyze artillery, air support, and special forces.
Let's examine Special Forces first, because their operational trajectory perfectly mirrors the overall IPKF learning curve. The dense jungle and urban environment was theoretically perfect for Special Forces, and 3 paracommando battalions were deployed. But initially, they were totally misused by the higher command.
Misuse in what way? Like put on guard duty?
Worse, they were ordered to operate exactly like regular conventional line infantry. They were sent out in large company-sized formations. They were saddled with a massive, slow-moving administrative and logistical tail, and they sought security in numbers.
Which completely negates the entire purpose of being a highly trained commando.
Precisely. As a direct result, they covered very little ground, made a tremendous amount of noise, and never achieved the element of surprise. But, unlike some of the conventional units, the Special Forces adapted rapidly. They recognized the failure of these tactics, shed the heavy administrative gear, and began operating in small, highly mobile, decentralized teams with strictly limited, selected objectives.
Doing actual commando stuff.
Right. They relied on speed, stealth, deception, and night infiltration. Once they started operating like true special operators, slipping through the jungle unseen to hit high-value targets, they achieved spectacular results.
That's a huge turnaround.
A major mechanical lesson derived from this was the absolute need for Special Forces to possess their own dedicated, integrated helicopter support for rapid insertion and extraction, as well as heavily miniaturized weapons and communications equipment to reduce their physical footprint.
Right. And speaking of the air, how did the Air Force and artillery perform?
Artillery employment was heavily constrained. Artillery is an area weapon, right? It saturates a grid square with shrapnel. Because the IPKF was trying to avoid civilian casualties in densely populated built-up areas, they rarely received clearance for massive artillery barrages.
Makes sense.
Furthermore, ground-level forward observers often couldn't see past the dense jungle canopy or the urban skyline to accurately adjust the fire. But this constraint led to a highly effective adaptation. The Air Observation Post, or Air OP.
Meaning having spotters hovering in helicopters.
Yes, they were extremely effective mechanically. An observer in a helicopter could look down into the compounds and jungle clearings, spot the targets, and direct highly accurate single-gun artillery fire.
That's a great workaround.
And more importantly, their mere presence in the sky acted as a massive psychological and tactical deterrent.
Oh, how so?
Well, the LTTE relied heavily on mortars, but they quickly realized that if they fired a mortar while an Air OP was circling, the observer in the helicopter would immediately spot the muzzle flash and call down a devastating counter-battery barrage onto that exact location within seconds.
Wow.
So the helicopters effectively suppressed the enemy's indirect fire just by being visible.
That is a brilliant example of tactical suppression. Now let's talk about something that absolutely fascinated me in the source material. It mentions the signals division, and it sounds like this was a massive unexpected area of success for the Indian Army, SIGINT, or Signals Intelligence.
It was arguably the single most valuable intelligence gathering tool of the entire operation. The LTTE, rather surprisingly for a guerrilla force at that time, possessed an extremely sophisticated and robust communication network. They were utilizing high-end Japanese Icon radios operating on the citizens band.
Okay, so they had good tech.
Very good. Initially, this posed a significant technical hurdle for the Indian Signals Corps because these specific receivers could rapidly lock onto 10 preset frequencies, allowing the LTTE to hop channels and making interception very difficult with standard military equipment.
So how did the IPKF Signals Corps crack the network?
They executed a brilliant technical pivot by capturing the enemy's equipment and literally turning it against them. Once IPKF infantry units captured several of these Japanese icon sets during raids, the Signals Corps reverse-engineered how they were being used.
Oh, that's clever.
They began using the LTTE's own captured technology to monitor their networks. By listening in on the citizens band, they intercepted a massive volume of unencrypted communications, yielding incredibly valuable real-time data on the location of LTTE leaders, supply movements, and impending attacks.
They turned the enemy's logistical strength into a fatal vulnerability.
They went even further than just listening, actually. They weaponized the captured sets.
Really? How?
The Signals Corps used the Japanese radios to generate specific frequencies, which they then fed into their own massive military amplifiers to successfully and completely jam the LTTE's communication network during critical firefights, isolating their commanders and sowing chaos.
That is incredible. While we're on the topic of logistics and support, projecting military force across an ocean has to be an administrative nightmare.
It is a profound logistical challenge. I mean, you have an Indian army that is fundamentally designed, equipped, and trained to fight massive conventional wars on its land borders against Pakistan or China.
Right.
Suddenly, that exact same army has to transport tens of thousands of troops, heavy battle tanks, artillery, and daily supplies across a sea obstacle into a foreign country. And this is where political optics heavily damage military efficiency.
Always the politics.
Always. When a military procures supplies for a massive deployment, the most secure, reliable, and economical method is to sign massive, long-term contracts for food, fuel, and transport.
Right, you lock in the supply lines and benefit from economies of scale.
Exactly. But the IPKF was politically forbidden from doing that.
Huh.
The exact duration of their stay in Sri Lanka was entirely unknown. More importantly, if the Indian military started signing 5-year contracts for base supplies, it would have conveyed a very dangerous political message to the Sri Lankan government and the international community.
It would look like an occupation.
Right. It would look like the Indian Army was planning a permanent, long-term occupation of the island.
Which would have caused a massive diplomatic meltdown.
So, to appease the political optics, the military was forced to rely on inefficient, short-term contracts. It was far more costly, incredibly stressful on the supply chain, but it was politically secure.
At the expense of the guys on the ground.
Always. They also suffered from a severe lack of adequate port facilities. The KKS jetty in northern Sri Lanka was practically non-functional initially. Mechanically, this meant that infantry troops would be flown into the Pali airstrip with only the weapons they could carry, while their heavy vehicles, heavy weapons, and logistical luggage had to arrive by slow transport ships days or even weeks later at the port of Trincomalee.
Wow, so you arrive, but your heavy guns don't show up for a week.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This completely fractured the cohesion of the combat units right as they were stepping into a war zone.
So, if a military strategist is reviewing this phase of the operation, analyzing the employment of arms and services from Chapter 11, the key takeaways are pretty clear. You have the vulnerability of armor operating in penny packets without infantry support. You have the severe physics-based danger of built-up areas and IEDs under thin-skinned vehicles. You have the critical failure of conventional units not utilizing fire and movement, contracted with the brilliance of SIGINT dominance using captured radios, and the absolute necessity for decentralized small-team tactics for special forces.
That is an exceptionally precise summary. The overarching, painful lesson here is that massive conventional forces must possess the institutional flexibility to ruthlessly and rapidly adapt their tactics when fighting a decentralized, asymmetric insurgent enemy on their home turf.
All right, that brings us to the next major phase of our analysis, Chapter 12. And for anyone trying to truly understand the anatomy of military failure and adaptation, this is the core of it. This is highest priority stuff. We need to categorize these successes and failures we just discussed.
Right. We need a framework.
Exactly. If you're a military historian or a strategist looking at this disaster, you have to break down the failure into manageable pieces to understand it. Strategists usually divide this kind of operational analysis into 4 distinct levels: political, operational, strategic, and tactical. It's often referred to as the POST framework, P-O-S-T. Let's use this framework to dissect the IPKF experience, starting at the top with the political level. What is the single biggest political lesson from Operation PAWAN?
The primary political lesson is the absolute peril of operating with a wavering, unfirm political aim, and the harsh reality that physical interference in the internal affairs of neighboring countries almost always ends in disaster.
Break down the ambiguity of that political aim. What was New Delhi actually trying to achieve?
The Indian political aim was a chaotic balancing act. They wanted to forcefully separate the warring factions. They wanted to enforce a highly complex peace accord. They were trying to satisfy the intense domestic political pressure from their own Tamil constituencies back in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu.
Right. There's domestic politics at play, too.
And they were simultaneously trying to keep the sovereign Sri Lankan government happy. Because there was no unified, detailed, long-term political end state defined, the government completely missed several opportunities for honorable military exits. Furthermore, the fundamental premise of peacekeeping requires the actual consent of the disputing parties.
Which they didn't have.
No, The IPKF deployed without the true, genuine consent of the LTTE, making the entire mission inherently flawed from the very moment boots hit the ground.
So they were deployed into a politically unwinnable scenario. And the ultimate lesson India extracted from this.
To never physically intervene with ground troops like this again. The Indo-Sri Lanka Accord was cynically used by both the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE merely to address their own immediate, desperate insecurities. And when those immediate needs passed, they both turned the IPKF into the scapegoat. India learned that despite possessing overwhelming military superiority and arguably good intentions, intervening in a neighbor's internal civil war yields massive, avoidable casualties and severe negative international publicity.
Okay, so that is the political level. Let's move down a tier to the O in our framework, operational lessons.
Operationally, the most glaring failure was the utter lack of jointness and unity of command, compounded by the haphazard nature of the deployment.
We just talked about troops arriving via aircraft while their heavy weapons were floating on a boat 2 weeks behind them.
Yes, that haphazard piecemeal induction of untrained, unacclimatized, and incorrectly equipped troops directly into a hot combat zone is a cardinal operational sin. It guarantees heavy initial casualties. But the command structure above those troops was just as fractured.
How bad was it?
You had severe overlapping command and control. The Indian Navy and the Indian Air Force were operating in the theater, but they were acting largely independently. They did not fall under the direct operational control of the IPKF overall force commander on the ground.
That sounds like a mess.
It gets worse. Furthermore, the IPKF commander was receiving direct and frequently conflicting operational instructions from Army headquarters in New Delhi, from Southern Command headquarters in Chennai, and absurdly from the Indian High Commissioner stationed in Sri Lanka.
Too many cooks in the kitchen, and they're all trying to bake a different cake while the kitchen is on fire.
Exactly. Without a unified joint headquarters established at the functional theater level, operations were disjointed and lacked synergy. The fundamental operational lesson is that modern warfare demands strict unity of command and the seamless integration of all military branches under a single operational commander.
Okay, P is political, O is operational. Now let's look at S, strategic lessons. This level seems to be very closely tied to intelligence gathering, right?
Intelligence is the absolute lifeblood of strategy. You cannot formulate a strategy without knowing the enemy. And the strategic failure here was a catastrophic lack of interagency coordination within the Indian intelligence apparatus.
The sources specifically highlight a massive dysfunction between the IPKF military intelligence, RNAW, which is India's external intelligence agency, basically the equivalent of the CIA and the Intelligence Bureau, or IB, which handles internal security.
The sources describe a scenario that borders on self-sabotage. It was an utter inability to achieve basic coordination. These state agencies actually possessed conflicting geopolitical goals.
Wait, really?
Yes. For years prior to the intervention, RNAW and the IB had been actively funding, training, and supporting rival Tamil militant groups to build leverage against Sri Lanka. When the IPKF went in, RNAW and the IMB were actively hiding critical intelligence from the military.
You're kidding.
No. The political considerations of the Tamil Nadu state government even drove them to deny the army access to vital intelligence regarding LTTE logistical networks and safe houses operating within Indian territory.
That is absolutely staggering. You have a military deployed in a foreign country taking fire, and your own national intelligence agencies are deliberately withholding information about the enemy's supply lines because of petty bureaucratic rivalries and local state politics.
It fundamentally undermined the entire military mission. How can an army dismantle an insurgent network when its own intelligence agencies are actively protecting parts of that network? The definitive military lesson here is that a comprehensive, successful counterinsurgency campaign is physically impossible without seamless, transparent intelligence sharing across all state and military agencies.
Wow.
A secondary strategic lesson noted in the analysis was the premature adoption of the hard option. The political masters in New Delhi forced the military into a kinetic enforcement rule against the LTTE before the IPKF had built up the necessary logistical, intelligence, and tactical capability in theater to actually execute it effectively.
You have to build the capability before you declare the intent to destroy the enemy. Understood. Finally, the T in our framework, tactical lessons.
Tactically, the overarching lesson was the necessity of overcoming what the military analysts call tactical obstinacy.
Meaning stubbornness, a refusal to change doctrine when the doctrine is getting people killed.
Yes. The IPKF initially attempted to fight a conventional, set-piece war against highly mobile urban guerrillas. The troops remained strictly road-bound, refusing to push into the dense jungle or clear the complex alleyways, which made their movements highly predictable and incredibly vulnerable to IEDs and command-detonated booby traps. They simply did not possess a doctrine for urban warfare.
What about the Heliborn drop? The sources detail a very specific operation that served as a massive, bloody, tactical lesson regarding air assaults.
You're referring to the Heliborn assault to capture the LTTE leadership at the Jaffna University campus. On paper, it was an incredibly bold decapitation strike,
Yeah.
but tactically it was deeply flawed.
What went wrong?
They planned a night insertion, dropping paratroopers and special forces from helicopters directly into a tightly confined urban landing zone, literally a football field surrounded by tall buildings. This landing zone was completely dominated by insurgent-occupied structures.
Dropping into a bowl while the enemy holds the rim.
Exactly. And crucially, they launched this operation with zero viable contingency plans and no quick reaction force standing by if things went wrong.
And things went wrong.
Terribly wrong. The LTTE had intercepted their communications. They knew they were coming, and they waited on the rooftops with heavy machine guns. As the helicopters came into a hover, they were met with a wall of lead. The troops who did manage to rope down were immediately pinned down in a brutal multi-day firefight with no immediate backup. The lesson learned in blood is that extreme tactical boldness must be paired with meticulous, redundant contingency planning, especially in highly restricted urban terrain.
Okay, so that is the POS framework. The perils of an ambiguous political aim, the necessity of operational unity of command, the requirement for strategic intelligence sharing, and the need for tactical flexibility.
Exactly.
But I have to ask a question that naturally arises when you review this material. We have just spent 25 minutes detailing immense operational failures, heavy casualties, horrific logistical blunders, and political betrayals. Looking at all these harsh realities, did the IPKF actually achieve anything? Was the entire deployment just a massive, unmitigated blunder?
That is a vital question, and it represents a trap that many casual historians fall into. They look at the messy, politically forced withdrawal in 1990 and assume total failure. But the military sources explicitly highlight that Operation PAWAN's macro achievements are frequently overlooked due to the negativity surrounding the tactical losses and political mess.
Right.
From a grand strategic perspective for the Republic of India, the intervention was actually quite successful.
Really? How do you define success in that context?
First, it preserved India's core strategic interests by completely thwarting the potential involvement of other foreign powers in India's immediate geopolitical backyard. Second, and most importantly for India's internal security, the IPKF effectively contained the virulent Tamil insurgency strictly within the geographical bounds of Sri Lanka, preventing a massive destabilizing spillover of militant violence and separatism into the Indian state of Tamil Nadu.
Okay, that makes sense.
Furthermore, the IPKF conducted massive humanitarian and relief operations, successfully disarmed several rival militant groups that were causing chaos, and actually facilitated the return of democratic provincial elections in the region before they departed.
That is a really important nuance for our listeners to grasp. The military didn't achieve the impossible, contradictory political mandate they were handed, but they successfully protected India's core strategic borders and prevented regional destabilization.
Precisely. They achieved strategic containment, even if they didn't achieve tactical annihilation of the LTTE.
So let's look at what happens when that containment lifts. Moving into chapters 13 and 14, we are entering the next phase of the conflict, covering Elam War 2 and 3 throughout the 1990s. The IPKF officially packs up and leaves in March 1990, and the vacuum they leave behind immediately explodes. We need to look at how the LTTE evolved from the guerrilla force that fought the Indians into something much larger and much more terrifying.
The interlude of peace didn't last long at all. By June 1990, the fragile peace talks between the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE collapsed completely, and Elam War 2 erupted. What we witnessed during this period is the rapid, bloody evolution of the LTTE's military structure.
How did they change?
They recognize that guerrilla tactics alone cannot hold territory indefinitely. So they begin shifting away from purely asymmetric hit-and-run tactics. They start recruiting heavily, fielding massive formations of fighters and effectively acting like a conventional army.
They start laying siege to massive, fortified Sri Lankan military bases, right? That requires a completely different level of logistics and firepower than a jungle ambush.
Exactly. They deployed large organized groups of cadres, thousands of fighters, to besiege massive multi-battalion SLAF garrisons. In 1991, they laid siege to the strategic Elephant Pass complex.
The Elephant Pass is the narrow strip of land that connects the Jaffna Peninsula to the rest of the island, correct?
Yes, it is the strategic gateway to the north. The LTTE besieged it for over a month, utilizing massive wave attacks, improvised armored bulldozers, and sustained mortar fire. They also vastly expanded their capabilities in other domains.
Like what?
They built up the Sea Tigers, a highly effective, deeply innovative naval wing utilizing swarms of fast, fiberglass boats armed with heavy machine guns. They could launch amphibious assaults, severely disrupt Sri Lankan naval supply lines, and protect their own illicit smuggling routes across the Palk Strait. The LTTE was essentially engaging in hybrid warfare, combining conventional infantry and naval assaults with devastating guerrilla terror tactics.
And the most devastating, psychologically shattering of those terror tactics was the introduction of the suicide bomber.
The Black Tigers. The LTTE essentially perfected the modern art of suicide warfare during this period. It became a core pillar of their military doctrine. And they didn't just use it against military checkpoints. They used it to execute a calculated strategy of high-level political assassinations that permanently altered the geopolitical landscape of South Asia.
Wow.
In 1993, an LTTE suicide bomber successfully assassinated Sri Lankan President Premadasa during a May Day rally.
The exact same Premadasa who had secretly armed them to fight the IPKF just 4 years earlier?
The very same. He believed he could control the tiger, and the tiger consumed him. But the most catastrophic strategic error made by Vallupillai Prabhakaran, the leader of the LTTE, occurred 2 years prior to that, on May 21st, 1991.
The assassination of former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi?
Yes. A female LTTE suicide bomber infiltrated an election rally in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu and assassinated Rajiv Gandhi. Prabhakaran viewed Gandhi as an existential threat. He believed that if Gandhi won the election and returned to power in India, he might deploy the IPAF back to Sri Lanka and crush the dream of an independent Tamil Eelam.
But looking at it from an objective, strategic perspective, killing him was a massive, almost suicidal miscalculation. I mean, historically, India, specifically the state of Tamil Nadu, was deeply sympathetic to the Tamil cause in Sri Lanka. It was their safe haven, their funding source, their logistical base. By assassinating the leader of India on Indian soil, the LTTE permanently alienated the Indian government and completely irreversibly dried up their greatest potential external support base.
You are absolutely right. It was a fatal, irreversible strategic error. It instantly evaporated any lingering political sympathy, economic support, or logistical safe havens that the LTTE might have enjoyed within India. The Indian state apparatus turned completely hostile. From that moment onward, India's foreign policy shifted irrevocably toward supporting the neutralization of the LTTE threat.
And this subsequent period, Elam Wars 2 and 5 running throughout the 1990s, it just reads like a gruesome, unending cycle of violence and attrition.
It was a brutal, bloody stalemate. The sources detail grisly, retaliatory massacres of innocent civilians in remote villages by both sides. When the Sri Lankan armed forces would mount a massive conventional offensive, such as their successful capture of the Jaffna Peninsula in 1995, it didn't end the war. It merely resulted in massive civilian flight. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, along with the LTTE fighters, retreated and escaped into the dense, impenetrable Vanti jungles in the northern mainland, establishing a heavily fortified shadow state.
And the LTTE demonstrated they could strike anywhere, even targeting the core of the state's economy.
The prime example is the July 2001 suicide attack on the Bandar Nike International Airport in Colombo.
I remember reading about that.
An elite LTTE suicide squad infiltrated the highly secure perimeter of the nation's primary international airport. Armed with anti-tank weapons and assault rifles, they managed to destroy a significant portion of the Sri Lankan Air Force's combat aircraft parked on the tarmac, as well as several multi-million-dollar commercial airliners.
Unbelievable.
The physical damage was immense, but the strategic damage was far worse. It caused the country's economy to completely nosedive, foreign investment evaporated overnight, and the vital tourism industry plummeted. It was a war of total attrition that neither side seemed capable of decisively winning, bleeding the country dry.
Which brings us to Chapter 15, the climax of this conflict, Elam War 4. This is a high-priority section. After 30 years of grinding stalemate, countless failed peace talks, and massive casualties on both sides, what actually changed? Why did the Sri Lankan government finally succeed in annihilating the LTTE in 2009?
To understand the decisive outcome of Elam War 4, you have to look beyond just the battlefield tactics. You have to analyze the shifting tectonic plates of the conflict. The tipping point that initiated the LTTE's downfall wasn't initially a military defeat. It was internal fragmentation and a massive environmental disaster.
Explain the internal fragmentation. What broke the LTTE's unity?
In March 2004, the LTTE suffered a massive, unprecedented internal schism. Colonel Karuna Aman, who was the highly experienced commander of the LTTE's entire eastern wing, broke away from Prabhakaran's central leadership in the north. And he didn't just leave quietly in the night. He took nearly 5,000 highly trained combat cadres with him.
5,000 fighters. That is a massive chunk of their entire army.
It was strategically devastating for the LTTE. The split didn't just rip away thousands of veteran fighters, it destroyed the LTTE's primary recruiting base in the eastern province, which had historically provided their best infantry. More crucially, it fatally compromised their operational security and tactical intelligence.
Because he knew all their secrets?
Exactly. Karuna's breakaway faction possessed intimate knowledge of all the LTTE's hidden jungle bases, their supply caches, and their operational methods in the east. They handed all of that intelligence directly to the Sri Lankan military. Then, just 9 months later, the December 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami struck.
I remember that vividly, a global humanitarian tragedy. But how did it impact the specific dynamics of this war?
The east coast of Sri Lanka, much of which was held by the LTTE, was utterly devastated. The LTTE suffered massive loss of life among their cadres, and their critical military infrastructure, particularly the coastal bases and vessels of their Sea Tigers naval wing, was physically crippled by the waves. Furthermore, the massive influx of international financial aid that poured into Sri Lanka largely bypassed the LTTE-controlled areas, being managed instead by the central government. This severely undermined the LTTE's political credibility and their administrative control over the local Tamil population, who were desperate for relief.
So you have an LTTE that is physically battered, internally fractured, and politically weakened. How did the Sri Lankan government capitalize on this exact moment in time?
Through a radical, uncompromising shift in political will at the highest levels of government. In November 2005, Mahinda Rajapaksa was elected president of Sri Lanka.
And the irony here is astounding. Rajapaksa was a hardliner, but he won the election largely because the LTTE enforced a strict boycott of the election among the Tamil population in the north and east, which effectively cost the more moderate pro-peace candidate the election.
It was another massive strategic miscalculation by the LTTE leadership. They thought they could pressure a hardliner, but Mahinda Rajapaksa was entirely different from his predecessors. He adopted an uncompromising peace-through-war strategy.
Meaning total war.
Yes. He was not genuinely interested in prolonged negotiations or international mediation. He prepared his state deliberately and methodically for a total military solution. And to ensure absolute, seamless, frictionless coordination between his political mandate and the military execution, he appointed his own brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, a former military officer himself, as the powerful defense secretary.
So you have total, unified alignment at the very top of the political military structure. There is no daylight between the president and the military commanders. But total wars cost billions of dollars. Where did a small island nation get the money, the modern weapons, and the diplomatic cover to wage a massive war of annihilation without the international community intervening to stop it?
This is where the Sri Lankan government played a truly brilliant, ruthless geopolitical hand. They played what analysts refer to as the China card.
Okay, explain the mechanics of the China card. How does that change a civil war?
The Sri Lankan government actively engaged with China, securing an immense pipeline of military and financial aid, estimated at around an additional $1 billion annually. This wasn't just cash. It was state-of-the-art, modern weaponry, fighter aircraft, heavy artillery, and endless supplies of ammunition.
Wow.
In exchange, China secured lucrative infrastructure development rights and long-term port facility contracts in Sri Lanka. But crucially, beyond the hardware, China provided an impenetrable diplomatic armor.
By using their UN status.
Exactly. China utilized its immense influence and its veto power at the United Nations Security Council to block or severely water down any international resolutions that would be critical of Sri Lanka's escalating military offensive or the mounting allegations of severe human rights abuses.
So China acts as a shield at the UN and a limitless armory. What about the Western powers? Didn't they try to enforce peace?
The global geopolitical environment had fundamentally shifted following the 9/11 attacks in the United States. The global war on terror paradigm allowed the Rajapaksa government to successfully rebrand their civil war, playing the terrorism card perfectly to Western audiences. Consequently, the United States, Canada, the UK, and the European Union all officially proscribed the LTTE as a foreign terrorist organization.
which means financial trouble for them.
Severe trouble. This wasn't just a label, it came with severe legal and financial consequences. The West actively froze LTTE assets and dismantled their front organizations. We were talking about choking off a massive, highly sophisticated global Hawala network, preventing billions of dollars in expatriate funding from ever reaching the Tigers.
So you have this incredible contrast. The LTTE is being financially suffocated and diplomatically isolated on a global scale, while simultaneously the Sri Lankan military is receiving a massive, unprecedented influx of cash, weapons, and diplomatic protection. So how did the SLAF translate this massive advantage into actual military action on the ground? The sources break the final offensive into two distinct stages.
Yes, a highly methodical campaign. Stage 1 was the systematic clearance of the Eastern Province. This offensive began in 2006 and was completed by July 2007. And this is where Colonel Karuna's earlier defection proved critical.
The intel he brought over.
Right. The SLAF heavily utilized the tactical intelligence and the active combat assistance of Karuna's breakaway faction to ruthlessly rout the remaining loyalist LTTE forces from their eastern jungle strongholds.
They secure the east, eliminating the threat to their flank, and then they pivot all their forces north for the kill. Stage 2.
Stage 2 was the final campaign in the northern province, specifically targeting the vast Vanity region. This was a military operation executed on a scale previously unseen in the decades-long conflict. The SLAF didn't just advance a single armored column up the main highway. They launched a massive, heavily coordinated, four-pronged simultaneous attack designed to gradually but inexorably encircle the LTTE's administrative capital of Kilinochchi and trap their entire force.
And they had to drastically increase the size of their army to pull this off, right?
It was a massive, rapid military expansion. They deployed newly raised formations specifically for this offensive. Task Forces I through 8th, fighting alongside the established 57th, 58th, and 59th Divisions. Over a short period, they expanded the total size of the Sri Lankan army by roughly 70%.
70%?
Yes, this was an absolute juggernaut of manpower and firepower moving simultaneously from the west, the south, and the east, while the Sri Lankan Navy effectively sealed off the coastlines so the LTTE could no longer receive reinforcements or smuggle supplies by sea.
So you have this massive, well-funded, highly motivated conventional army slowly closing a noose. What was the LTTE doing in response? How did a highly mobile guerrilla force try to defend themselves against this juggernaut?
And here we arrive at the fatal military error made by Prabhakaran and the LTTE High Command. Despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, the LTTE made a conscious, disastrous decision to fight static defensive conventional battles. They constructed massive, elaborate defensive lines known as ditch-cum-bunds.
Explain mechanically what a ditch-cum-bund is.
It is essentially a massive, continuous trench system paired with a high earthen wall. They dug deep ditches, often flooding them with water, and piled the excavated earth into massive walls, heavily fortified with concrete bunkers and machine gun nests. They attempted to hold this static territory, essentially trying to fight a World War I-style trench war against a modern military.
That strategy makes absolutely no sense mechanically. I mean, it's like a lightweight, incredibly agile boxer deciding to stand completely still in the center of the ring, dropping his guard and trying to trade heavy, static punches with a super heavyweight. By getting into a trench, you completely negate your only real advantages, your speed, your evasion, your ability to melt into the jungle, and you expose yourself to the one thing your opponent has vastly more of: raw, crushing, indirect firepower.
That is the perfect analogy. The LTTE was a brilliant, lethal guerrilla force when they were mobile, but they were a terrible conventional army when deprived of their supply lines and forced to hold a line on a map. By packing their fighters into static ditch-cum-bund positions, they allowed the vastly superior SLAF artillery batteries and the Sri Lankan Air Force to simply locate them and pound those trenches into dust day after day. The LTTE simply did not have the heavy weapons, the endless ammunition reserves, or the replaceable manpower to sustain a grinding war of static attrition against a state military that had just grown by 70% and possessed limitless artillery shells from China.
And the end result of this static defense?
Total catastrophic collapse. The four-pronged encirclement worked precisely as planned. By early 2009, the shattered remnants of the LTTE, along with their leadership, were forced into a rapidly shrinking, barren coastal strip known as the Vani Pocket. Tragically, they brought hundreds of thousands of Tamil civilians with them into this pocket, essentially trapping them as a massive human shield in the crossfire. The final battles in this confined space were incredibly ferocious, apocalyptic in their destruction, but the outcome was mathematically inevitable. On May 18, 2009, near the muddy banks of the Nanthikadal Lagoon, Prabhakaran was killed in a final firefight, and the LTTE was completely destroyed as a functioning military and political force.
So if we are looking at the decisive factors of Elam War 4, the critical elements to remember are the internal Karuna split that bled their intelligence, the devastating impact of the tsunami, the geopolitical shield provided by the China card, the financial strangulation from the global war on terror, the massive 70% LAF expansion, and above all, the LTTE's fatal mechanical error of adopting static ditch-cum-bun defenses.
Exactly, a perfect storm of geopolitical shifts and catastrophic military errors.
All right, this brings us to Chapter 16, the climax of our deep dive. This is very high priority. The ultimate comparative analysis. We have seen the timelines, we have explored the battles, but now we need to synthesize the why. Why did the Sri Lankan Armed Forces succeed so decisively in 2009, where the mighty, well-funded Indian peacekeeping force struggled so mightily, taking heavy losses back in 1987?
The divergence in outcomes comes down to a fundamental difference in the application of the instruments of national power. Let's analyze the Sri Lankan success factors first. The absolute most critical factor was an unwavering, singular political aim.
Total commitment.
Yes, the Sri Lankan government's objective was simple, brutal, and crystal clear: the total physical annihilation of the LTTE as an organization. Unlike previous administrations, they did not waver, they did not seek a negotiated settlement when they gained the military upper hand, and they outright ignored immense international pressure and demands for humanitarian ceasefires.
And this ties directly back to our impartiality clause at the top of the deep dive. We have to discuss the dark, mechanical reality of how they achieved that unbroken momentum.
Yes. From a strictly clinical, military analysis perspective, a major factor in the SLAF's operational velocity was the government's complete and total disregard for domestic and international criticism regarding civilian casualties and collateral damage.
They took off all the restraints. They stopped worrying about the China shop.
They did. When the IPKF saw it, they operated with one hand tied behind their back. They restricted their artillery. They took casualties clearing houses manually to avoid dropping bombs on civilians. The Rajapaksa leadership, conversely, shielded their military commanders from the political fallout of alleged human rights violations. They gave their generals complete, unhindered operational freedom to use whatever firepower was necessary to advance, alongside massive manpower and budget increases. Furthermore, they controlled the media narrative tightly, aggressively restricting journalist access to the battlefield so no adverse reporting or images of the destruction could leak out to damage domestic morale or trigger an international intervention.
So politically, they had total commitment and total cover. But what about tactically? Because just throwing more bodies and artillery shells at a trench doesn't always guarantee you win a jungle war.
Tactically, the Sri Lankan military underwent a massive institutional innovation. They finally realized that advancing massive, noisy conventional columns down main roads into the jungle was suicide, which, ironically, was the exact same harsh lesson the IPKF learned 2 decades earlier. So the SLAF fundamentally changed their operational doctrine. They created and perfected the SIOT.
SIOTs. Explain the mechanics of that. What does it stand for and how does it work?
Special Infantry Operations Teams. These are highly trained, specialized deep penetration teams consisting of just 4, 8, or 12 men.
Small, stealthy teams. Almost exactly like what the IPKF Special Forces eventually figured out they needed to do.
Yeah, exactly. But the Sri Lankan military didn't just reserve this tactic for a few elite commando units. They institutionalized it across the entire conventional army. By 2008, they had roughly 30,000 regular infantry troops, heavily cross-trained and operating in these small SIOT teams.
Let's talk about how a SIOT actually functions mechanically in the field, because it is totally different from a normal patrol.
It is the antithesis of a conventional patrol. If you send a 100-man infantry company into the jungle, they are loud, they require constant resupply, and the LTTE hears them coming a mile away, steps off the trail, lets them pass, and shoots them in the back. But an 8-man SIOT team operates completely differently. They infiltrate deep behind enemy lines, mostly at night, carrying heavy packs because they operate with zero logistical tail, no supply trucks following them. They don't carry massive, noisy radios. They carry miniaturized, encrypted gear. They establish hidden observation posts deep in the jungle canopy, and they just wait in silence for days or even weeks.
And when the LTT finally moves, what do?
By the time an LTTE supply convoy or a command patrol moves down a trail, the SIOT doesn't usually engage them directly in a firefight. They use their one distinct advantage over the guerrilla force. They stealthily paint the target and call in massive precision artillery or airstrikes from miles away. They also laid thousands of ambushes and targeted LTTE mid-level leadership. Essentially, they were fighting the guerrillas using advanced guerrilla tactics. They turned the deep jungle, which for decades had been the LTTE's impenetrable safe sanctuary, into a terrifying active kill zone. The LTTE never knew where the next attack was coming from, which kept them completely disbalanced and terrified.
Okay, so that clearly explains how and why Sri Lanka won. Why, specifically and mechanically, did the LTTE lose? We talked about their massive strategic error with the static ditch Kumbun defenses and the intelligence hemorrhage from the Karuna split.
It was a fatal confluence of fighting past their prime, massive strategic miscalculations, like the assassinations that alienated India, and a severe, insurmountable resource crunch. By attempting to expand from a nimble guerrilla force into a massive conventional army holding territory, they vastly overextended their supply lines at the exact historical moment that the international community, driven by the West's global war on terror, completely choked off their financial lifeblood. In the end, they were completely bankrupt, internationally ostracized, internally divided, and tactically rigid.
Okay, if you are a military analyst trying to summarize this entire conflict, you need a comparative framework. If someone asks, why did the Sri Lankan military succeed where the Indian peacekeeping force struggled? You can break it down into 4 analytical pillars: aim, force structure, tactics, and the humanitarian approach. Let's analyze each pillar, contrasting the 2 forces. Pillar 1, the political aim.
IPKF aim. Highly ambiguous. They were deployed to find a peaceful, democratic solution, heavily restrained by the political optics of being peacekeepers. SLAF aim. Utterly unambiguous, to completely crush the militancy through absolute military force operating with zero political restraint.
Pillar 2, force structure.
IPKF force structure. A heavy conventional army, piecemeal inducted into the theater without preparation, utilizing vehicles and equipment meant for open plains and desert warfare. SLA force structure. Over the years, they evolved into a force tailor-made specifically for jungle counterinsurgency, massively expanded in size, with modern weapons procured precisely for this specific conflict environment.
Pillar 3, tactics.
IPKF tactics. Initially reliant on large, noisy, road-bound formations, predictable patrolling patterns, and heavily restricted use of supporting firepower. SLA of tactics. Total systemic reliance on small team SAODs, deep jungle infiltration, covert penetration raids, combined with the massive, completely unrestricted use of heavy artillery and air power against static LTTE defenses.
Pillar 4, the humanitarian approach.
IPKF approach. Heavy, sincere investment in winning hearts and minds, focusing on restoring civil administration, conducting relief operations, and accepting military casualties in order to avoid civilian collateral damage, which severely restricted their operational speed and firepower. SLAF approach. A clinical, ruthless disregard for the massive displacement of the civilian population or the resulting human suffering, eventually clearing the operational space of constraints to maximize the application of overwhelming, annihilating firepower.
It is a stark, almost chilling comparison when you lay it out like that. One military force tried to enforce a complex peace while wearing handcuffs. The other waged total, unrestrained war.
And in the brutal, unforgiving calculus of this specific conflict, total war proved to be the only militarily decisive approach.
Wow. Okay, we've covered an immense amount of ground, history, and military theory today. Let's move into our outro and ensure these concepts are locked in. Let's do a rapid-fire volley of the top 10 lessons from Operation PAWAN and the Elam Wars. I'll hit the odd numbers, you hit the evens. Number 1, you need a clear, unwavering political aim. If the politicians in the capital don't know exactly what they want the end state to look like, the military cannot win it for them on the ground.
Number 2, an exit strategy is absolutely non-negotiable. Do not deploy forces into a foreign country without knowing exactly how and when they'll leave, or you risk falling into the Primadasa paradox, where the host nation turns on you.
Number 3, intelligence sharing is vital. If your own internal state agencies like RNAW and the IB are hoarding information or supporting rival factions, you are sending your troops into battle blindfolded.
Number 4, do not fight urban insurgents with conventional road-bound tactics. Do not bunch your troops up in narrow streets and get your infantry out of their thin-skinned armored vehicles when operating in terrain heavily seeded with IEDs.
Number 5, small teams beat large patrols in the jungle. The eventual success of the IPKF Special Forces and the massive systemic success of the SLAV's ISIATs prove that speed, stealth, and small footprints win asymmetric wars.
Number 6, insurgencies inevitably die without external funding and logistical support. The global war on terror and the loss of Indian support financially and materially suffocated the LTTE's ability to wage conventional war.
Number 7. The biggest geopolitical lesson for India: do not physically intervene with ground troops in the internal civil wars of your neighbors.
Number 8. The harsh moral trade-off of counterinsurgency. Attempting to win hearts and minds and protect civilians severely restricts your firepower and slows your operations. Total war maximizes your operational velocity and firepower, but it requires a government willing to endure immense international condemnation for the resulting human suffering.
Number 9. Geopolitical backing dictates local wars. Sri Lanka, playing the China card to secure UN veto protection and limitless artillery shells, was the diplomatic shield they required to win on the ground.
And number 10. Tactical flexibility is survival. The LTTE's fatal mechanical error was adopting static, conventional ditch-cum-bun defenses against a vastly superior conventional state army. They voluntarily surrendered their flexibility, and in doing so, they lost the war.
Brilliant. And just to recap our comparative analytical pillars one last time, the IPKF approach was restrained, conventional, and politically ambiguous. The SLAF approach was unrestrained, tailored around small teams, and defined by total war.
That is the very essence of the operational analysis.
All right, that brings us to the end of Module 3. But the journey of understanding this conflict isn't over. After thoroughly dissecting the deep operational lessons of Operation PAWAN today, our final deep dive, Module 4, is going to apply these very lessons directly to India's future security challenges. We will look at how modern conflicts are shaped by these exact dynamics. You will not want to miss how the ghosts of the Sri Lankan jungles actively shape modern military doctrine today.
It is where the hard lessons of history meet future strategy. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought, something to mull over as you review the mechanics of this conflict.
The way they're honest.
We spent the last hour contrasting the IPKF's painful struggles with the SLAF's ultimate decisive victory. But consider the vastly different constraints they operated under. If the Indian peacekeeping force in 1987 had been given the exact same ruthless, uncompromising political mandate, the exact same diplomatic shield ignoring international optics, and the exact same unrestricted operational freedom to wage total war that the Sri Lankan army had in 2009, would the war have ended 2 decades earlier? Or does an intervening foreign power never truly possess the political capital required to wage total war on someone else's soil?